Oh, well, good evening. I don't know if this is makes it a little bit easier with the microphone, does it? Okay, I think it does. I sat in the back last week and I found it was a little bit difficult to hear. And of course, we've had a nice variety of talks here. And if you recall last week's talk, it was a rather marvelous presentation with this marvelous new equipment. Well, we're going back to the old-fashioned equipment this evening. We're only one step above lantern slides here. And that's a slide projector, which, by the way, this is not a far-fetched idea. They are really passé. And they're moving on, and you can't buy them anymore, or not easily anyway, because they don't make them. So what you saw last week is where everything is going. This evening, what I would like to do is just tell you something about the Cotten Centennial that occurred. And of course, in last week's presentation, you had music and action video, and I got a little bit of music that I would like to just start this program off with, and I'd ask you if you can identify the tune. So let me just play this for you. Okay, that gave you enough of the tune. Anyone know the name of that tune? King Cotten. I'm glad. I didn't think anybody would get it. Of course, it was King Cotten. It was written in 1895 by John Philip Sousa for the Southern States Cotton Exposition in Atlanta, Georgia. And the reason I used this evening was to say that this tune could just as easily have been written for Fall River, Massachusetts in 1895. Cotton was as much king here in Fall River as it was in the southern states in 1895. We didn't grow cotton, but we knew what to do with the cotton. And by the turn of the 20th century, Fall River was the largest producer of cotton print cloth in the world. We had 1/3 of all the spindles in the world were located in Fall River, Massachusetts. And the only other city that could compete with us was Manchester, England. And so cotton was king in Fall River as it was in the Deep South at the beginning of the 20th century. And so what they decided to do, of course, in 1911 was celebrate the fact that King Cotten existed here in Fall River, and they had something called the Cotten Centennial. They chose 1911 because that was the date of the first cotton mill in the city. And therein is where we will start our presentation. That's pretty good. Four balloons up. Cotten Centennial Carnival, June 19th to the 24th in 1911. Before we talk about the festivities themselves, I think we have to talk about what was the reason for these festivities. This is a map of Fall River in 1812. What's up a pond? The Congregational River. And it was this portion of the Congregational River here that is what was very important. There were a series of waterfalls, the water dropping about 130 feet in a distance of about a half a mile or so. And the early entrepreneurs recognized the fact that that falling water was going to provide the energy for some sort of manufacturing at some later point. Here's a close-up of the lower portion of the river. In the earliest days, the Church family, Benjamin Church and his family, owned one side of the river, the lower portion, and the Bordens owned the other side. The Churches eventually sold their side to the Bordens, and at this point you see, if you look at the names here, Bordens own all the land on both sides of the falls, so they control this particular area. But this isn't where the first cotton mill went in. First cotton mill went in up near Father Kelly Park, on the northeast corner of South Main and Globe Street. And this was the first cotton mill in Fall River. Jay Lambert, on the second lecture series, if you like, remember he mentioned this mill and did mention that this is probably not the first mill that there was. It may have been built on the site of the first mill. The first mill may have even been made of wood. What's rather interesting in this particular case was this wasn't really a cotton mill per se. The cotton was brought to Fall River and then was shipped out to farmers' homes. And the women in the family picked the cotton at 4 cents a pound. They took the seeds out of the cotton, was returned to the mill where it was spun into yarn. This was really a yarn mill more than anything else. The yarn was then returned to the farmers' homes where it was woven into cloth. And this went on from about 1811 to about 1817, never very successfully. And the mill, of course, was built by Colonel Durfee. And another view of the mill. This pond that was here was later filled in. Father Kelly Park is built on the fill. And of course, in 1813, the first mills began to be built on the stream of the Cookishan River. And what they needed was the fast-flowing water to turn their water wheels. In a relatively short period of time, the lower falls were completely covered over by mills with their water wheels working, turning belts, which in turn would turn the machinery inside of the mill. And of course, what will happen later on was the steam engine was invented. You no longer needed that falling water, but you needed water to make steam. So the mills were located along the edges of the South Watuppa Pond for the most part. And here you can see this 1911 photographs with all of the mills belching their black smoke, burning thousands of tons of coal a week. Later on, when the city water came in, you could build a mill anywhere. They brought the water to you in a pipe under the ground. And so the later mills were built away from the edges of the pond. In 1843, many of the early mills that were downtown burnt to the ground in the Great Fire. And the first of the great mills, the big mills, was built in about 1846. Of course, one of the great printing companies was the American Printing Company, which was located in the old Florida Iron Works building, down where Firestone is today. And it gives you, if you can't read this, it just says that the floor surface was 50 acres, and the area of the land was 38 acres. There were 7 cotton mills. The main chimney was 350 feet tall. It had 467,400 spindles and 13,103 looms, and they could produce woven cloth at the rate of about 80,000 pieces a week. And this was the largest cotton print factory in the world. And of course, the man who made it work, perhaps its best, was M.C.D. Gordon. We get to the actual Centennial. So the Centennial, really, the city fathers got together along with the unions and the politicians and the businesses and decided that they would choose 1911. You notice the dates were right around the summer solstice. I think that was done on purpose so that they'd have plenty of light to work with. And of course, on the first day of the Cotton Centennial, we had the crowning of the Queen. Her name was Marion Hills. And here you see her coming down. There was a whole procession that came down the street, led by 4 mounted policemen, all Irishmen, by the way. And whether Irishmen like to be policemen or they like horses, or maybe both, but in any case, they led the parade. And here you see Queen Marion and her court followed her in several other carriages. And here's a close-up of the Queen. At City Hall, she was greeted by Mayor Higgins. And you can see the City Hall was very well decorated. What's interesting here is that the Germania, this is the Germania Band, one of many bands that were organized in the city of Fall River. There were a lot of brass players and musicians in Fall River. And this is the Germania Band, and I have to assume that they were mostly Germans. Okay? The bugler, by the way, who led the procession down Main Street was a man named Otto von Glick, who obviously was a German. But the director of the Germanian Band was an Irishman, McCarthy. And so he was the leader of the band. And they played one of Bert Anthony's marches, the Imperial March. Remember Bert Anthony? We talked about him in the first lecture that we had at the beginning of the session here. And so they played one of Bert Anthony's marches. And they played for the opening ceremony. And here again you've seen the Queen in her carriage, and after being made Queen, she was then drove around the city waving to all of her subjects, if you like. There also opened in the city several different exhibitions. At the Fall River Public Library, there was an exhibition of Fall River art, mostly Fall River artists. At the Durfee Textile School, as it was called in those days, they had an exhibition of various types of cloth, brocades and that fancier type cloths. At the Armory, the manufacturers had their displays, and at the Music Hall there was a history and antique display. And by the way, there was a charge to see all of these. It was sort of one of those one ticket you can take in all of the various events. And there was a great deal of excitement that was created in Fall River for this bicentennial. This had to be the biggest bash that was ever thrown in the city of Fall River. And again, here's Mayor Higgins greeting our Queen. And this arch was built across Main Street. It's made of wood, by the way, with a marble finish on it, but a pretty neat job. And during the bicentennial in Fall River, there was some thought of recreating this arch across Main Street. And it was decided that it was too costly, and there were all sorts of insurance concerns, and so it really never got built. But this was the arch down, as you can see, near the City Hall. And you can see the heavy decorations here at his Talbot's men's store. And you can see all of the buildings were very heavily decorated. And this is the arch at night. The arch was illuminated at night. This is 1911 now, and they're using electric lights at this particular, at least downtown. And then all along the city street, Main Street, there was illumination. So this was the place to be during when you wanted a little bit of action, if you like, you went downtown. And perhaps many of you remember when downtown was the place you went to if you wanted some action. If you go down there now, you'll be the only one there. But I can remember working in Kennedy's for many years, and you know, it was just the streets would be jammed on the weekend. But unfortunately, those days are gone forever. Again, a view of South Main Street. You can see the decorations. Everybody was out to have a really good time here. You see the heavy decorations, and again, these pillars, which again are made out of wood with this marbleized finish. And another view looking up. I always like these pictures. All of the men have their soft hats on. Okay? Memorial Day, you took those off and you put on your straw hat. Okay? And you wore your straw hat. And you'll see some gentlemen with straw hats later on. I always remember going with my dad, and he always had a hat. And I always remember when he went by the front door of a church, he tipped his hat. And if he saw a lady, he tipped his hat. You're lucky if anybody even talks to you now. But it was a different time, wasn't it? And again, on the second day was the automobile day. Now, there were enough people in Fall River with money so that they could have their automobiles. And so they decked out their automobiles with flowers and plants and crepe paper. Unfortunately, it rained while the parade was on, so some of the cars, especially those that were decorated with crepe paper, left the parade, because you've ever seen what happens to crepe paper when it gets wet. It's not a pleasant sight. It just simply dissolves. Here's the first prize and special grand prize, and you can see this with all the ladies with their bonnets on. And this was on the large parade that was held on the second day of the carnival. A little bit gaudy, I think, but you have to keep in mind that there were still lots of people with horses in town. And so horses are also a big thing as well. This fellow has covered his car with a boat. You can see it's rained over here. Maybe he had the right idea. And he must have listened to the weather report. And he was mentioned in the newspapers of the day. That, along with one of the automobiles, was decorated like a big bale of cotton. And it was just driven down the street, completely covered over with this great big bale. Here's the gentleman with his straw hat. And by the way, in the evening, there was the evening of where the fireworks, and the fireworks were held on at South Park. A company named Lloyd's of New York provided the fireworks, and they started 1 hour late, which seems to happen even today. And I don't know whether the reporter, he reported that the fireworks were shipped by fast freight. It took 5 days to get from New York City. You could have walked with them in 5 days, perhaps because they were dangerous cargo. So I have to guess that the reporter was sort of tongue-in-cheek in this thing, right? But 5 days for fast freight. They used a set piece, by the way. The set piece said, "Loom Up, Fall River." Remember set pieces? The Columbus Park fireworks had numerous set pieces. You hardly see them today because everybody wants a lot of big bangs and booms. And not too many people are interested in watching something burn rather quietly. And so, they played George Foley's "Loom Up, Fall River Boys." That's one of the songs you heard, the marches you heard in the first week of the lecture series. If you remember, Al Destin sang that for you or played it for you. And so, that essentially was the fireworks. And then after the fireworks, another song that, by the way, and this was the second band, the American band played that concert that night. One of the tunes that they played was a tune called "Come Josephine in My Flying Machine." And you'll see later on what they were pretty much referring to, because later on you'll see that one of the events was based around flying machines. Now I got a kick out of the gentlemen with the straw hats. They had these bands. They would replace, or simply over the top of the band of the hat, they had these hat bands that you would put on. And they would go downtown, and as I said, things like "I'm in Love" was one of the hat bands. "My Home Is Yours," "I'm Out for a Good Time," whatever a good time was in 1911, and "Oh You Kid." And those were some of the slogans or that you saw on the hat bands. And again, another picture of the City Hall, as you can see. Very heavily decorated. R.A. McQuirk Company. If you remember McQuirk's, you could buy anything in McQuirk's. Anything. When I got married, we got into our apartment the day before the wedding. I went to McQuirk's, I bought some shades. When I came back, not only did they bring the shades up, they installed them for me. Jerry, I was told. I didn't know the guy's name until now, but okay, we're going to thank Jerry, otherwise they would have had these big windows with no shades in them. Same picture, by the way. And here's sort of an aerial view taken from a tall building, and you can see the crowd lining up for the parade. Now, on the third day, we have what was called day 2. Just check my notes here. Okay, this was the Trades Parade, by the way. I'm sorry, the Trades Parade, and this was the big parade. Now in the morning, Ringling Brothers Circus was in town, and they had a parade around noontime, and this was followed by the Trades Parade at 3 p.m. So you had 2 parades to watch. They estimated the crowd at about 150,000 watching the parade. Now, where do they all come from? They came by train from Boston and from Newport and from Providence. And when the circus came to town, they generally would run excursion trains into town. So people took advantage of these to come in and get 2 parades for the price of 1. You can see Old Mill Coffee in the truck, Coble and Osborne Mill Supplies. But look at the crowd. It's during the Bicentennial Parade, I rode the entire length of the parade route, and people were 2 to 3 deep, and that was pretty good for a Fall River parade. But here they're wall to wall, literally from the curb to the building, which sort of blocked them in. And so there were about 150,000 people that day. See the various groups again, and this of course is down the granite block is right here, the old granite block. Now this may have been taken on the parade that occurred on the Thursday. I don't know, but it didn't start till 8 o'clock. And with the kind of film they had, I don't think they had too many pictures. It stayed light. There was no daylight saving time in those days, so it got dark around 7:30. So I'm going to guess that this is probably in the trades parade. And the newspaper did write about the endless wagons. Look at them all, which got to be a little bit boring after a while. One wagon after another with a little sign on the side, and people got a little bit tired of that. I think it's like going to a modern parade and it's having 50 automobiles pass by with people you don't know. That's pretty much the same. People who built houses and things were rather interesting. And this is the waterworks float. Here's the waterworks tower you see on here. And the waterworks were advertising. They had only been in business by this time for 20, 25 years. And here you see a view on North Main Street looking south. You can see the City Hall over there to your left, and the parade passing under the arch. This is a contractor, and his float is simply an unfinished house. You see it here, lining up for the parade, and there it is in the parade. Near St. Anne's Church, they had the living flag, and they had their students all dressed in red, white, and blue, and they formed the flag. They sat on the steps of St. Anne's Church. And again, another view of the marchers going down the street. Kind of interesting. Warwood and florists here. And Sokol's Restaurant was one of the finer restaurants in the city at the time. Now in the morning, they had the circus parade. And this is the circus parade, and you notice the crowd is still tremendous. What you see here is what I thought was a 16-horse hitch, but it's not. It's a 16-camel hitch. There are 16 camels pulling that circus wagon. And the circus did very well, by the way. One of the things that they reported was that, because this was the Ringling Brothers show, they had over 1,200 employees. They had over 600 horses that they brought with them. They came to Fall River in 85 railroad cars on 5 trains. They came in 5 separate trains. And in spite of all the activity going on, still did a pretty fair business in the city of Fall River. And again, another view of the circus parade here. The next day, of course, was the horse show. And this was called Merchants' Day, and this gave the merchants a chance to advertise and to have sales, if you like. And so the merchants were having their sales, and at 10 o'clock in the morning, they had the first of several horse shows that would eventually occur at North Park. And of course, there were still people in the city that maintained the Hackney pony here. They were jumping. Not everybody made the jumps, as you can see. There were draft horses, and again, obviously a prize winner, another Hackney pony. The ladies riding side saddle. Always wondered how a lady could ride side saddle. All I could do to ride a horse straddling it, without falling off. I always seemed to be coming down as the horse was going up. It was like a bolo bat. And of course, some people made it over the jumps, I guess. Four in hand. And I don't know, this may be Spencer Borden. Is it? Anyone know? This gentleman here on this rather fine horse. And you know that Spencer Borden raised Arabian horses, and he raised them out, and raised some of them out here at Interlaken. If you know where Interlaken was, at the end of New Boston Road, where you can still see it from the road, the old ice house is at the beginning. And here's a view of the horse show at North Park, and you can see the old school that was located right in the park, if you recall, on the fire station down here. By the way, in the evening of the horse show, just to go back when they did have what they called the Grand Carnival Parade. That was the one that was held in the evening. And this gave a lot of the military groups a chance. And by military groups, I don't necessarily mean Army, Navy, Marines, but a lot of the churches had military drill teams, the French, the Portuguese, the Irish, and they would compete in these competitions. Religious groups had a chance to be in the parade. And then in the evening they had their grand, what they called confetti carnival. And evidently they sold bags of confetti, which they then threw at each other and got some sort of glee out of this thing. And the newspaper reported the following, that the people who were the targets of the confetti were sailors who had the jumpers with the V-necks, and also, and I quote, girls with low-neck dresses were in great demand as wearers of confetti and went on them like rain. So you never notice people never change, do they? So everyone had a grand time. They did try to prohibit ticklers. You know what a tickler was? You blow into it and it comes out and it's got a little feather on the end, and so you can reach across and tickle somebody's ear with it. They tried to ban that for some reason. And of course, as soon as you do that, it just means that people buy them. It's like when they have parades nowadays, you tell the vendors, none of that silly string and none of those snaps that you throw and explode. And so you watch the guy going down the street with a load of snaps and silly string, even though they're told not to sell them. So they kind of eventually gave up on that. The next to last day of the Cotten Carnival was President's Day. And the President of the United States thought it was important enough to come to Fall River and to take part in the festivities. This is the Mayflower, the presidential yacht, as it lay at anchor just off the Ironworks dock. It was escorted up the bay by the battleship Connecticut, which could not come up the river, but again anchored in Mount Hope Bay, somewhere off Common Fence Point. The Mayflower was escorted by two revenue cutters. Revenue Service was the forerunner of the United States Coast Guard. The Gresham and the Acushnet were the cutters that came up and escorted the presidential yacht up into the Taunton River. And again, here we see another view of the yacht. And here we see some of the dignitaries, military and civilian, waiting for President Taft. And here he is arriving at the Ironworks dock. You can see him over here, the man with the rather magnificent mustache. You also see some of those gentlemen with their straw hats. I don't see any of those banners on them, but maybe they had taken them off by then. And here we see him. He did go to all of the exhibits in the city, took part in all of the activities, and eventually gave a talk before he left at South Park. He's a big man, rather imposing, somewhere in the neighborhood of 350 pounds, I understand, with that big walrus mustache, and was often referred to as a walrus. And you can see him again here. Here he's exchanged his stovepipe hat for a straw hat, which would have been a cooler hat to wear. And it looks like at this particular point, he did go down to the armory and look at the various displays. The very last day of the Cotten Centennial was Aviation Day. Come Josephine in my flying machine. And here is the flying machine, the airplane of Glenn Curtis, no less, who came to Fall River. A lot of this depended whether he came here on the weather, and the weather was fine, and he was able to land his seaplane in the Taunton River or Mount Hope Bay up near South Park. And here you can see Glenn Curtis at the control. Not much to this airplane, essentially a frame and a double wing and a pontoon and a propeller. And he did take off and land a couple of times, and then he raced the speedboat and probably had a hard time defeating the speedboat. Now, airplanes at that time did not really go all that fast. They were just enough speed to really stay in the air. If you ever saw that movie, It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, there's a scene where everybody's rushing to this treasure, and one couple rents an airplane, one of these bi-wing planes, and as they're flying along, they look down and the cars are going faster than they are. And I think in this particular case, Glenn Curtis probably had all he could do to defeat the steamboat, or the speedboat, I should say. And of course, that ended Fall River's party, the Cotten Centennial. And we used this slide in the first show. And again, there are no speed laws in Fall River. The sky is the limit. And I'm sure that in 1911, they thought the sky was the limit, that this was going to go on forever. Okay, we were the leaders in the production of cotton cloth. In 1912, the number of spindles in the city peaked. But the cotton industry maintained itself for the next few years. In 1922, they had a little over 31,000 people working in about 111 mills. In 1923, they had just under 30,000 people working in those mills. And in 1924, they had just under 21,000 people. The number of employees dropped by 1/3 in 1 year. The handwriting was really on the wall, and perhaps people just refused to see it. What did they have going against them? One, cheap labor. The labor in the South was less than it was here. There were no unions. Unions were strongly discouraged. People would work for less. Secondly, they're close to the raw material. If they ship cotton from Georgia to Fall River, why not just make the cloth in the South, which is what they did. And then, of course, finally, and Jay alluded to this in his talk, the fact was they never put money back into the mills with modern machinery. They were still using older machinery. They were happy with the profits they were getting, and simply they were outperformed by looms that would produce more cloth at a cheaper rate, using cheaper help, closer to the source of supply. And in the end, Fall River was pretty much, I don't want to say doomed, but certainly the cotton industry in Fall River, the handwriting was on the wall, or just a case of whether you were going to read it or not. But in 1911, the sky was the limit in Fall River, and everybody was quite happy. And that pretty much is, again, what we were doing in this particular case was celebrating this great industry in the city of Fall River. And that was the end of the party. Does anyone have any questions, by the way? The Queen was Marion Hills. Marion Hills, and the story I heard was that her sister had originally been picked as queen, and was a rather shy, retiring person, and that Marion stepped in for her sort of at the last minute or not. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I just repeat the stories that I hear. Question?
I'm just curious about what was going on in the mills while all these festivities were going on. Were people paid if they weren't going to work? Like, what was...
I don't think, in those days, I don't think, some of the mills closed for the week. I don't think the people were paid. I don't think that's something they did in 1911. I don't know whether they had vacations or not in 1911. Do you know, Jay?
I think at the period of 1911, an average worker was probably only putting in about 9 months out of the year. They were already cutting back in 1911. The only thing that really saying that was the period of 1920 was the First World War. Had it been the First World War, you would have had the President Sloan.
And the Depression really finished them off. 29, 30, the number of mills dropped precipitously, and only a few survived into what I would call a more modern era toward the end, but they simply disappeared. Some of the mills closed part of the time, but there were 2 or 3 mills that stayed open, and they worked full time. Now, what would happen in this case, even though people didn't make a lot of money, a lot of people didn't show up. Rather interesting, for instance, when the circus was in town, one of the things that would happen is that people wouldn't go to work that day. They'd go to the circus. And these were people that when you stayed away from work, you didn't get paid. And there was no such thing as sick leave. And so that's something that would happen in this particular case. So I guess if you went to work, you get paid. If you didn't go to work, you didn't. Some of the mills did not open at all, though. They closed for the entire week. But as Jay mentioned, at this point, they were some people only working about 9 months out of the year anyway. Are there any other questions? Reverend Art Lawrence did mention if you have some ideas, some things you'd like people to do some research on,